and very excited to be here and to collaborate with you again. So my name's Michael Kalish. If you haven't, if you don't know me already, my background is, hey, ciao, ciao Emilia. So we do have somebody very special from Italy that's chiming in from the Istituto Lattiero Caseario, which specializes in meat and dairy processing. I was lucky enough to attend that institute for 2 years, and it's fantastic. If you'd like to check them out, please do. They're sponsored by the European Union. Emilia, if you'd like to scrivere il sito di web, everyone can go visit aginforum.it. So my background is quite long. When I was in college, I pursued apiculture, commercial beekeeping on the side, and that got me eventually into dairy, where I then got into meat processing. And I was lucky enough to train around the United States and Europe, including France, Switzerland, Italy. Spent about 4 years over there. Aginform.it. Thank you, Emilia. Grazie mille. And that's where I got my first introduction to food safety. And I worked on over a dozen different farms, I think about 15, and started managing operations in France, then next in New York City, and moved back to California to start this consulting company with my twin brother, Charlie. It was a very similar experience. So in all of our experiences, we've come into contact with food safety plans and food safety plan development and implementation. And we've seen the pain that can go along with creating these plans and implementing them. And we decided to develop resources and an approach to developing food safety plans and other programs that might help you meet Global Food Safety Initiative, audit scheme criteria, and FSMA. So we're going to take a look at what kind of skills team members will need to have, as well as teams together. So let's jump in. Here's our agenda. We're going to look at the new costs of doing business, because a part of this is compliance, another part of this is staying competitive in the global market. More and more distributors are requiring that you demonstrate your compliance with FSMA, but also provide them with some sort of third-party, call it a certification, like GFSI. So we're going to take a look at the individual skills, the team skills, where things can go wrong, and talk about how we might be able to provide you additional support later on. Okay, so here's a little joke for me. A lot of times, I come across people who are looking for a shortcut, and so I put this little person here at the top of GFSI saying I lost my arm to a consultant, want this number. It's really not that uncommon. FSMA does have some costs associated with it. GFSI, Global Food Safety Initiative, certainly has more. We typically find the costs going into labor, but also improvements made to the facility. The good news is that the skills that an individual need to comply with FSMA or conform to GFSI related standards are fairly similar. So I found that if you're investing in your team, there are only a number of skills you really need to require your team to have. And they're not things that you have to go out and look for. You can invest in existing human resources and get these skills developed in-house. And that by far is the best way to not only save money, but be assured that implementing your systems will be realistic and doable, since your team will be effectively the people creating it. So they'll have to take some ownership and understand better how to implement. So let's take a look at the different skills here. The first one is read regulations. So FSMA has a lot of new requirements. For some of you businesses out there, they might be old requirements because you're used to third-party audits. But nevertheless, it's important to understand how to read regulation. There are titles, parts, subparts, sections, there are provisions, and having a fluency with the language around regulations is going to help everybody understand what they need to do to comply. It'll also help them prepare for an inspection by an FDA inspector or state inspector on behalf of FDA. Next is conducting a hazard analysis. Charlie actually got a Fulbright to study in Oslo for a year, and all he did was research. And funny enough, there are these really great research skills that are very easy to learn to help you navigate the World Wide Web. So for us, conducting hazard analysis, a lot of people are doing a very similar processing types. And for that reason, there's a tremendous amount of research out there already. In most cases, there's FDA guidance. or industry guidance. And so being able to tap those existing free or affordable resources, understanding how to conduct a hazard analysis is very important. Composing policies and procedures. This is just really just a skill of writing. Composing preventive controls. Again, just learning how to write within the format of a food safety related document, something that is just as important as writing policies and procedures. Next is a training program. Charlie and I, in a past life, pursued teaching for quite some time, and we both got credentials, me in math, Charlie in science, and had a lot of experience developing training curricula. So there are some really basic skills to building a training program. For me, there are two approaches. If we have time at the end, we'll touch on modular approaches to training. But what I will say is that there needs to be less text on a slide and more visuals. People normally only take away, X% of a presentation, but if you're relying on 100% for compliance, that's not acceptable. So producing less text on a slide, more visuals, obviously is important. Next is verifying personnel performance, storing records, and performing internal audit. So we'll be touching on these things in the next few slides. So those are all the skills that are required for complying with FSMA. And these are things that you can build in-house. If you're moving to GFSI, to a global food safety initiative, these, I've kind of grayed them out here, but really it's the same thing. Instead of reading regulations, you're reading audit criteria. You'll be building more policies and procedures, more records. You'll be expanding your training program. And that's pretty much it. And all those skills that you develop for FSMA are going to carry over into GFSI. Like I said, one of the bigger costs associated with GFSI is improving your facility. All right, so let's take a look at those different skills sort of broken out a little more simply. And I do find that the most important thing for to make food safety a little more accessible is taking something complex and breaking it into its simplest components so they can be approached one by one. For me, that's what this presentation is all about, is breaking out what's very complicated, that skill set. Most of you have probably seen the job posts from Cargill, for example, on, if you want to join their QA team, what do you need to know? What do you need to do? You need a bachelor's of science. That doesn't always convert well into all the skills that we need, but certainly helps. Normally, the job description is very long. But these are the 5 points I really want you to take away for an individual. So here you can see we have code, guidance, research. We just need to accelerate how much we can navigate the web, the code, and the guidance, because there's a tremendous amount of gold there. It's just piled under so much dirt. It's easy to lose a lot of time. If you're familiar with lean manufacturing or Six Sigma or Scrum, these project management methodologies that look to eliminate waste, we operate on the same principle, and we should here in the food industry. We work with grocery stores where waste is just enormous, but for smaller businesses and manufacturers, a lot of times waste is just an accepted thing. When we're developing plans, we don't want any defect percentage. We want to try and eliminate as much time waste as possible. So reading and navigating is incredibly important. Next is writing. The biggest time waste for food safety plan development is formatting. So juggling text, tables, and diagrams, it's tough. And if you can find a really effective way of doing it, you're going to save yourself a whole lot of time. I'm going to just type in a website right here. This is used by NASA, Twitter, Disney. It's a diagramming software. It's an alternative to Visio. And actually, Charlie's made some really great do-it-yourself videos using lucidchart.com. Great org charts, diagrams, and other types of diagrams. And it integrates seamlessly with Microsoft and Google. And I think it's something less than $5 a month. So it's worthwhile if you want to just do it for a month and discontinue. They don't pay us any money. We're just huge believers because it saved us so much time. All right, so next we're going to look at speaking. So when you're speaking within the context of food safety, your voice and word choice is very important and varies. So if you're speaking to FDA or the state, if you're speaking to a lab, if you're speaking to the CEO, if you're speaking to your team, an auditor, a customer, you need to learn individuals need to learn how to be able to speak with these different types of people. Obviously, with the CEO, you're speaking very high level. With FDA, you're letting the inspector speak, but you're also touching base on compliance issues, not quality. And as an internal auditor, if you're talking to your customer, you need to be aware of what the requirements are. So learning how to speak, if this isn't incorporated into a training program, you're really missing out on making the most value of your QA department. So I mentioned that formatting is a huge time waste, a source of time waste. Well, this is the next big one. This is navigating files and folders. A lot of people that we've come across, both when we're working for them or consulting them, have built files and folders kind of like assembling a train. You know, it's just one train car after one train car. And there's no, if you were to zoom out, there's no real structure to how the folders are organized. Maybe they were created initially because their layout was convenient, but as the requirements expanded or as their programs increased, the files and folders just start stacking onto one another. And then if you are practicing any kind of document control, or you're superseding documents and maintaining the older versions, you can imagine I'm not one of those people that has a desktop with 500 files on it. I can't live that way, but some people can. So it's really just finding how can I make sure that not just me, but other people can navigate my files and folders very quickly. Because in the event of an audit, for whatever reason, if I'm not available, or if someone else isn't available, or needs to get access to some kind of records, they're able to easily and intuitively navigate those files and folders. So we're going to take a look at what that looks like. And next is computer literacy. And we'll touch base on that in just a second. For an intuitive, oh, thank you, Charlie. I just saw your note in the chat. So I was speaking about moving intuitively through your files and folders. For me, that begins with a document registry. That's something oftentimes mentioned within GFSI audit schemes. So like SQF, for example, they'll ask that you have a document registry. This is really just a table of contents that lays out all the records that you and programs you would have to show an auditor. So here you can see I just have a sample here that this happens to be, it's a document register. I'm just calling it a centralized list. There is no requirement for this with FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization, but it nonetheless can certainly help streamline an audit or inspection should FDA come and visit you and ask for your programs. Having a table of contents for your binder or for your program electronically is just a great way to be able to quickly navigate documents. So here you can see I have standard operating procedures as section 7. This is an intuitive way of using document numbers. Now I know anytime there's a 7 that comes before a document, I know it has to do with some kind of procedure. And I can go a little more granular and I can sort of categorize these procedures into subfolders like 7.1 or 7.2. 7.2, if I ever see that number, I'll know it has to do with employee hygiene. You can do this for standard operating procedures, but you can also do this for policies. It's a great way of being able to make sure that when you print a binder, that if you can go ahead and use this list as a table of contents. And should you lose a document or supersede it, you can go online and find it electronically in the exact same order. So something very important for navigating files and folders internally is having a common sense document registry. Now, what about, there are a lot of businesses out there that organize their documentation according to the requirements. So I've worked for, well, I know one business that they organize their records according to, I believe it was NSF International's GMP audit, which has sections A through L. And we'll touch base on the problems that come with that. This is the question that I would ask you to ask yourselves. That's a lot of asking, isn't it? Should documentation be organized to make it easier for the auditor or for the food safety team? So a lot of people, we think of food safety as a form of assurance. Should we get an inspection? Food safety is the thing that's going to be our get out of trouble free card. So obviously it's important for the auditor because they're the ones gauging our compliance by looking at our records. That's why we're painfully filling them out every day. Now, don't get me wrong, it's important for ensuring the safety of the food as well. But having a paper trail is especially important for auditors. So I want it to be easy to navigate for the auditor, but I also want it easy to for my food safety team. My food safety team is going to work with it for, I don't know, 200 days a year plus. My auditor is going to be using it for maybe 1 or 2 days the entire year. So how do we make this easy to navigate for both the auditor and the food safety team? We're going to look at that. This is a picture of what happens if you organize your documentation according to the requirements. So let's start with my example earlier. There's a company decided to organize their document registry. Instead of having a document registry, they organized all their documents and records into folders that were consistent with the GMP audit by NSF International. So here you can see I have it organized according to sections A through L. Well, now the prevent controls rule for human food rolls out. So now I have to deal with subparts A and G. So now I got a third-party audit and I have some compliance requirements that are forcing me to decide how should I organize my documentation. Should I use prevent controls or GMP or both? Which obviously is a big threat in terms of redundancy. Next, let's say I want to scale up. And today, I know people use BRC or SQF. I chose Primus just as an example. This is obviously under the Global Food Safety Initiative. It's an audit scheme. So now let's say you want to scale up and you want to meet Primus's requirements. Now we have to organize our documentation according to 3 different things. SQF is getting really popular. So maybe now, geez, a lot of my sister facilities are SQF. I'm getting pressure from upper management that they'd like me to go SQF. So now I'm going to shift over to SQF modules 2 and 11. So now I've gone through 4 different ways I need to organize my documentation. And if you have a lot of documentation for your food safety plan, this is obviously going to constitute a big problem. This is going to probably eat up someone's full-time job and reduce their productivity within your company. So this is one solution to that problem. So if you were to embrace the document register, for example, registry, so you can make intuitive understanding. Oh, Jane Bauer, is there a good site to find the differences, benefits of various audit schemes? You know, let's talk about that afterwards, and I can talk to you about that on the side as well. There are some people have found BRC a little easier to approach. SQF is notorious for being prescriptive, but all these audit schemes are undergoing revision, and those revisions be rolled out in the next few months. There have already been some draft documents that have come out for SQF, for example. And so these audit schemes are going to be changing. So it's a good time to reassess where it is you want to be. Okay, so here to take an example, I'm using Primus again. They have a set of documents where they have a standard, they have expectations, and they have a checklist that they have. And they all correspond with one another. They're just broken out in different documents. They're called normative documents. Anyhow, this is these requirements, these expectations, these standards, these are things that the auditor is going to be coming into your facility thinking, okay, these are the things I need to understand. What are the compliance activities and documentation that demonstrate conformance to my standards? Okay, so Charlie and I invented a thing called blueprinting process. It's fairly, I'm sure people have been doing it for a very long time, where you just gave it a name so we can talk about it a little more, a little more easily. And essentially what we do is we list the requirements on the left from top to bottom. In this case, I just align the standard with the expectations with a checklist question that the auditor will have in mind. And then I state what policies, procedures, and forms I have to demonstrate my conformance to their standard. And you can do this with FSMA, you can do this with a third-party audit. The goal is to create a master key for your auditor or inspector. So when they come in and ask for your documentation, you can provide them with this index, which really is just a reference to your document register. So you can registry. So when there's a question, how do you comply with this standard? You can see what policy, procedure, or form you have. And by its number, you can find it either electronically or in your binder and demonstrate and show it to the auditor or inspector. So it's a very common sense way of approaching compliance and conformance. And when I say compliance, I mean federal compliance with regulation. When I say conformance, I'm usually talking about a standard. Okay, so computer literacy. We're going to touch base on navigating files and folders again a little bit later. We'll deep dive into blueprinting. Just to touch on computer literacy, there are a few different skills that are very important. So the Food. There are different ways that food safety can be. There are different ways that an employee can disrupt your food safety programs. One of them is by disrupting your documentation. So it's very important when you're dealing with documentation and extending sharing privileges to modifying documentation that there are some security policies and that you also have some password management. So if there are multiple people that can access your documentation, make sure that they are responsibly maintaining their passwords, that they're changing them at some kind of frequency. This is again something that you'd want to fold into your training. Application skills are just as important, if not more. So when you have somebody trying to draft a policy, a procedure, maybe a record-keeping form, it does require some mastery over basic applications that one might find typically on a computer. So Word, Excel, their equivalents in Google, these things do require some skills. And if you haven't ever sat down with somebody and watched them produce a document, you might be surprised because you'll see kind of where things slow down. And when you see someone trying to create, for example, a flow diagram in Excel, or in Word for that matter, or even PowerPoint, you can almost sort of see the money spent on labor just going down the sink. And for me, it's worthwhile spending just a little bit of time with somebody so that they can be a little more proficient in using these applications. It'll save a lot of time and money. And lastly is search engine skills. And this is something that I touched on earlier when we were talking about reading, is how do we navigate the web very quickly. Google has built into its search engine search operators that can very quickly sweep aside millions of hits that might be irrelevant and zoom in on things that are very relevant to your search query. And bibliographical referencing. Charlie, could you write down easybib.com for me? That is just an amazing resource. It's free. And if you never want to go back to high school and buy an MLA formatting book again, you can go on easybib.com. Charlie just shared the link. And they generate citations for you. So remember, HACCP-based systems, which are included in both FSMA and GFSI, do require that your determinations and justifications are science-based when you're conducting your hazard analysis. So what better way than to generate a citation for when you make a statement justifying your determinations within hazard analysis? EasyBib is just, you can literally just copy and paste a URL into it. It'll generate a citation. It'll be a quick way to give your auditor or inspector assurance that your plan is substantiated by science. Okay. So those were the individual skills: read, write, speak, navigating files and folders, and computer literacy. If you haven't invested any time in your team up till now, this is a good time to reflect on these 5 things. Now, individual skills are one thing. Thank you, Charlie. But team skills are quite another thing. So we're going to shift gears and start looking at what kind of team skills are important. First is defining meetings and schedules. I personally never really liked meetings, right? They always go too long. People use it as a time to get on a soapbox. Oftentimes I'll go into a meeting and then I'll see upper management just spin off and just start asking questions about things across the entire business. And when we leave the table, it's very unclear what the action plan is on, what I originally intended for the meeting. So defining meetings is just as important as scheduling them. And normally this comes along with an agenda, and so you can tick off your points. And I personally love meetings that are 15 minutes and shorter. So we typically call these things standing meetings. For me, meetings should be the pulse of the company. It's the time where if you know that you're going to come to a meeting every Monday or every Friday or meet for 10 minutes in the morning. That's something I did at a French company and I loved it. What was perceived as complaining becomes more of a sort of responsible check-in. So if someone says, hey, I noticed this thing, maybe we should address it, that's something that you typically bring up in a morning meeting. If you don't have that ritual, if you meet only so often or whenever there's a problem, it's very easy to start sort of putting on the earmuffs and not hearing people's problems, or at least perceiving the problems to be complaints. Defining meetings is an important one. Now, if you're focusing on food safety plan development, there's a thing called Scrum that comes from the Agile methodology. It was introduced in the 90s, and it revolutionized the tech industry. Google, Amazon, all the big players with multi-billion-dollar projects that really needed a dependable deadline, shifted gears and started focusing on Agile. And within Agile is a thing called Scrum. So I'm just going to introduce it generally to you. And it's a fantastic thing that really carries over into food safety as well. What it is it requires a team of individuals that can self-organize. This is why it's really important that you invest in their skills, to meet together and decide what it is that they're going to work on each sprint. That can be a week long, it can be a month long. I like having sprints that are week long. And I'm grossly generalizing what Scrum is here. There's typically a project owner that's going to be creating a list of all the requirements that the team will have to set out to fulfill. And then this team would meet on a weekly basis as well as a daily basis to discuss what it is they're going to be working on for the sprint and what their progress is day to day. The goal is to identify impediments that might slow them down and to remove those by the end of the week. That way, each sprint will be moving quicker and quicker and quicker. And the results have been tremendous within the tech industry. And if you'd ever like to talk more about Scrum, Charlie, I'm sure we can organize a presentation that can address all of its components a little more in detail. But this is generally what it looks like. We've seen some companies approach this way, where they'll make a list of all their requirements. Here, in this case, it's on a wall using Post-its. And they typically assign the task a certain number of points, depending on its size. And over the course of the week, they say, okay, we're going to work on 50 points this week. This is how much we're doing. This is a snapshot, say on Wednesday or Thursday. And by the end of the week, we'll have moved all those points to the done pile. Now, points is a way of creating a quantitative metric so we can see what our velocity is as we move through the project. It's a way of also being able to identify the success of removing impediments. And again, we can go into Scrum a little bit later in another presentation. But this is just a way of being able to really visualize within your company on a wall, but also to C-level executives how well you're moving through a project. You can also extrapolate, say, if you accomplish 5 points over the course of a week, you can then extrapolate and say, well, we're going to need X number of weeks then to get through 950, unless we really accelerate. And so that's what Scrum is all about, is moving those impediments and very quickly over time being able to take on more and more points each week. You can see here, sprint 1 I have 50, then I might be able to take out 100, 225, 625. The idea is that you'll become a more fast working team together. So let's focus on meetings. On Mondays, these are the best days to recalibrate the team, get together. Here I'm suggesting an hour and a half, but obviously it only has to be as long as it takes to discuss what kind of requirements are we going to satisfy today. So if we're looking at FSMA or looking at GFSI, normally having some sort of roadmap will facilitate this meeting and keep it much, much shorter. Meeting every day. This is something I did in France at Mons, which is a cheese aging company. They met every day. I think it was 10 minutes, 15 minutes long, Monday through Friday. And it couldn't have been better. It was really, everyone was on the same track. Problems were addressed as they came up. Even if you're not practicing Scrum, I'm a huge believer in daily meetings. Next is Thursdays. This is where we're looking to the next week and we're deciding what it is that we're going to work on. We're looking at what kind of progress we've made. And there is a thing called Retrospective Meeting within the context of Scrum, where we would focus on how we feel about the project, what do you think we're lacking, if we need training in a certain area that would help us be faster. That would be called a retrospective meeting. Okay, so you've probably heard this quote before. If this gets any more difficult, I'm going to have to ask you to stop helping. So there's a real threat with real-time collaboration. I know that it's the rave right now with Dropbox, Google, and all those other cloud-based applications. But real-time collaboration is only as good as it is as the sort of standard of communication you maintain. So how many people here have been on emails where they're CC'd and it has nothing to do with them? Anybody? Okay, I've been on a lot of those. I'll be CC'd, and eventually you just stop listening, and you just start. I mean, I've seen people totally miss deadlines because they just missed what was in a previous email. They were CC'd, they just didn't think it was so important to them. Also, I've seen a lot of QA people. We typically like to take responsibility of something and then just leave us alone. We'll come out of our den when it's done. Um, that also sort of really hurts the productivity of the team. So developing criteria for written communication is really important. If you want to get granular, you can go as far as down to email, articulating what appropriate subjects might be, how the content ought to be laid out, and what kind of length it would be acceptable. Keep things 100% read. Then there's also a discussion about limiting your CC. Criteria for in person, for me, an agenda is always critical. If I have an agenda with 5 points by the end of the meeting, if I haven't covered the 5 points, then I know the meeting didn't go well. If I hit the 5 points, I know I can finish early. And these are a few other types of things. All right, so defining roles. Here I built out a role relationship chart so you can sort of see how business might approach FSMA or GFSI. So first, I mentioned a project owner who's developing a list of all the requirements that the team will have to address. And a big part of that architecture, developing that list of requirements, is also prioritizing them, because you don't want to flood. The worst thing you can do to maintenance or operations is flood them with an enormous list of things to do. What you'd like to do is, and actually this kind of reminds me of the experience I had in Gruyere. I remember we had 71 cows. I was working in the Alps with a herdsman, and I was there for the most of the summer. And he said, okay, bring the cows into the milking parlor, but slowly. And I learned very quickly that morning what too quickly means. I flooded, his stall. We were individually tethering them up for milking, and I flooded it with like 30 cows all at once at the very beginning. And there's so many cows milling around, he couldn't do anything with them. It was just a debacle within the dairy. And I learned through that experience the importance of pacing. And it's no different when you look at developing documentation with different departments within a company. You really have to pace how much you want them to get done. Because if you give them 20 things or 30 things, stay consistent with the metaphor, um, they're only going to get X% done. And they won't be held accountable either. So if you give them 2 things and ask them, please have these done by the end of the week, let me know if you need any help, we can walk through it. And they don't get 2 things done, and those 2 things only took maybe an hour, 2 hours to do. You can focus in on what the real problems were. They're accountable for that. So pacing is a big part of the architecting of your approach to developing a food safety system. So here in this chart, I have 4 departments at QA, Ops, Sales, Marketing, and Accounting. And my goal here is to maintain a backlog, identify what they're working on now and what they've accomplished. And what I want to do is have a lead from each of these departments and have a frequency of meeting or schedule for meetings where I can delegate and touch base on the content. Okay, so let's take a look at what it means to define a task. Here I pulled an element or clause from SQF code. This is clause or element 2921, has to do with employee training program. What blueprinting is about is identifying the evidence for the requirement. So remember, I mentioned earlier that we're listing the requirements on the left-hand side of a spreadsheet, and on the right side, we're listing all the evidence for what it is that we're doing to demonstrate our compliance. So here I've identified the evidence. I have an SOP, and I have a modular training organizational chart. I've also provided the link. So in the event that an auditor sees this, they can, or somebody leading an auditor through a desk audit, for example, can use the link to quickly access that documentation. As always, I'm really focusing on limiting the amount of time waste I have associated with navigating files and folders. So if you're maintaining a system electronically, great. That lets you share pages as their individual websites. So you can grab their links and share them very quickly. Here you can see I've delegated to somebody. So if I have any issue with compliance here, conformance, I can refer to this quality assurance manager, Michael Kalish. So I was using the term architect. How do you architect or prioritize what requirements each department's going to take on. This is my favorite way of starting a project, is I'll make a list of all the sections of the code. So if it's FSMA or if it's GFSI in this case, it's SQF, or no, I'm sorry, this happens to be Primus. And I've identified what sections I'll be giving to which departments. And while I've said these are sort of broken out from left to right according to what sprint I want them to work on, you can think of this as priority. So the number one priority thing I want for a department to work on would be on the left, and the lowest priority would be towards the right. And this is a way of organizing the requirements so you can paste them out to each department as they show progress. And that's what we call delegation. So that's a form of delegating the requirements, big picture, but as we go small picture, as we zoom in, these are the requirements here. And right next to them, I can put these columns here, which are the evidence, policies, procedures, forms, or other kinds of documentation that would demonstrate my compliance. For tracking these things, I can assign them here in another set of columns, and I can keep track of what status they are. So I can see what's complete and what's not. And with this input, with this data input alone, I'm going to move to the next slide. I'll show what it looks like all together. With this complete, you can actually generate really useful charts or a dashboard that will sort of keep everyone else up to date on how well things are moving along. And I'll show you what those look like in just a moment. So let's go back to the organization of the documentation. Now I have an internal key, which is my document registry, for people within my company to navigate files and folders. Electronically and printed, the organization will always look the same. The document numbers will have a defined meaning. On the right-hand side here, I have the inspector auditor key, which I call a blueprint. And this is a place where standard to standard, row to row, an inspector auditor can see what kind of documentation and compliance activities I have to demonstrate that I am in conformance with their standards. Okay, I can also see who's accountable. So these two ways of organizing documentation do not disrupt one another. The key will always be the key, the internal key, or the document registry will always be the document registry. So as I scale my business, I do not need to disrupt how I've internally organized my documentation. Saves a lot of time, keeps it intuitive for every party involved. Okay, I mentioned dashboards. So with the input of who's doing what and when, or in what priority, according to what priority, you can generate these really useful diagrams or dashboards that can self-update. So I use, in this case, it's Google, but you can do it in Microsoft as well. Spreadsheets allow you to create pivot tables, to generate charts, and you'll have to dial in to a future presentation so you can learn how to do that yourself if you don't know already. There are some excellent self-tutorials online on how to create pivot tables and charts, and that's how we produce these things. So we can send snapshots to C-level executives, for example, to give them assurance that the resources aren't being wasted. Yeah, keep going. This is an alternative. Well, it's not an alternative. It's another thing you can add on to your blueprint. But if you want to hide the development columns, once the system is fully developed, you can expand these columns and use them to perform an audit. So here I can state whether I'm in compliance or I'm deficient with each standard, and I can issue a corrective action and assign it to somebody. So I haven't. I'm going to go to the next slide here to show you what it looks like. So I have the standards still written out just as it was before. I just have a different set of columns that I've made visible on the right-hand side as I flex this document from being a development tool into being an internal audit tool. And this is a fantastic way to conduct internal audits. That is a requirement for GFSI and for FSMA. So if you're looking for developing a program to perform internal audits, think about using this kind of tool or this kind of approach. Blueprinting is a great way to also understand, well, if I'm deficient on this standard, who is responsible for developing these conformance activities and documentation? You can expand the development columns and see just who was working on it and when. So it's a great way to sort of have also a paper trail of who developed what, so when deficiencies happen, you can touch base with that person and make the correction. Okay. Now, when you perform an audit and you say, well, we were deficient here, we were in conformance there, this is what I was talking about in terms of a pivot table. So you can grab the data that you inputted, the nonconformance and the conformance scores, and that can generate for you a very quick list as to how well you conform to it. So this is another thing where just automating it using a spreadsheet doesn't cost any more money. It just requires that you have that skill set to be able to produce a pivot table, produce a chart, and maintain it over time. Saves a lot of time, and believe me, after 15, 20 years in the business, you'll be able to spend so much more time working on other things like generating sales. Okay, this is again just an example of a chart where I'm broadcasting sort of my audit score. Once you get handy with using these things, and believe me, you get really excited about using them, or at least that's the kind of person I am. And it's always nice to have somebody like that on your team. These are the individual skill sets that we discussed. These are also the skills that teams really should invest in to be able to build and maintain an effective food safety system, or system really of any kind. And so I hope you're able to approach this. And if you have any questions about it, please follow up after the presentation, shoot us a question. We're more than happy to address your issues. And if you have any proposals of things we might miss, we'd love to hear that too. So the big question is, what is the greatest impediment to developing, implementing, and maintaining a food safety system? I'm going to use this tool here, which was developed by Noster and Villa, and in the year 2000, and it was sort of titled "Restructuring for Caring and Effective Education." I think it's very appropriate here in this presentation. So change. When we see change, when we see the ability of a team to develop a food safety and quality system, it requires vision, requires certain skill set, which we discussed earlier, incentives, resources, and an action plan, which is what our blueprinting was all about. So when does confusion happen? It happens when there's a lack of vision. I've worked with a number of companies in the past where the QA mission was more owned by QA than it was upper management. So, weren't sure, were we going towards SQF? Do we need to be in compliance with all FSMA rules? If someone doesn't have the vision, the ability to architect the program, what it is that we need to comply or conform to, there's going to be a team-wide confusion. Anxiety happens when we don't have the skills. I've met a lot of people where they don't feel comfortable using a web browser or navigating the web, or they don't feel comfortable using Word or Google Docs. And the result really is just a whole lot of anxiety. A way of managing team anxiety is by, in the very beginning of the project, focusing on what skills that team will need. And we've reviewed those in this presentation. Resistance happens when there's a lack of incentive. A lot of people work overtime or on salary in QA, and so if they're not compensated or rewarded for trying to meet a very tight time schedule for a food safety audit or inspection, it can create a tremendous amount of resistance. That's just within QA. Within ops, for example, or other places where QA has a profound impact, should. Not having that incentive is going to make it difficult to maintain or implement what you develop. So coming up with an incentive for operations and other departments to participate is important. And I find that ownership, or taking responsibility for creation of a program, is something that helps remove those barriers. Frustration, this is where the resources aren't available. So I was talking a little bit about incentives, but time. People don't have time, or they don't have the training. Those things can really make a team frustrated. And lastly is the treadmill, no action plan. So I've seen a lot of businesses where the backlog of things to do is empty, and they really are not clear. What's the next step? What should I be working on? If I finish early, what else might I be able to work on? So for me, an action plan is both making that list of requirements, but also creating, some sort of pacing, so people know what to do as soon as they run out of things to do, or next week something that they can look forward to. Okay, so this is our presentation on the food safety team, individual and team skills. I do have, and we have a little bit of time where we can touch base on the training program development, which is a modular approach. And I might just do a couple slides, and then I'd love to open it up for Q&A. And if you have some questions, please go ahead and type them. So modular training involves training blocks that can be arranged and applied in a variety of ways. This makes training development easier because instead of trying to rewrite a large training program, you can just take blocks you've developed elsewhere and put them in the arrangement you need. So it helps also for scaling. So if you need to add on an additional thing, so we talked about the move from FSMA compliance to GFSI, you would have a training program for your regulations, for meeting your regulations, but then you would need some additional training. Instead of trying to rewrite the entire training program, you could just add on a module. And that's actually what SQF is doing, is they're sort of breaking up their audit criteria so they can be a little more modular. So if you want to tack on the quality training, or the quality audit, you can do that without compromising your certification audit. We've introduced you to lucidchart.com. I'm just going to be using that to develop this, and so I'll show you what it looks like. So this diagram represents a company's entire training program. There are 17 roles, and there are 9 modules that are represented in color. Okay, so you can see that module 1, the gray color, captures all the roles. So an example of this would be employee hygiene or GMP policies. It could also include food defense or recall if you wanted to, when you activate a recall plan, you want to activate everybody to be on alert. For example, if there's a recall of a product and you want to limit what is communicated externally to to the press or to customers, everyone in the company is going to have to be on board, because it's very easy for people just to speak their mind. They don't understand that you want to curate what's broadcasted to the general public. Okay, thanks, Charlie. So module 1 would be something that would apply to all roles. Module 2, in this case, is a little yellow box around the line operator. The line operator would then need to be trained on module 1, but also on module 2. So these might be work instructions, things related to their day-to-day operations. So the way this works, as you move up the ladder, so here I have a line operator, and I have an operations supervisor, and I have an operations manager above that. So here the supervisor needs to know what the line operator is doing, because that's who they're supervising. So they're required to have module 1 training, just like everyone in the company, module 2 training, because they're responsible for people trained under module 2, and module 3, which is a supervisor training. Okay. So this way, in this sense, it's modular, because the supervisor goes through 2 trainings, 1 and 2, and then to be a supervisor receives a supervisor training. Okay. So as you move upward, they get shorter, and the training program becomes shorter and shorter. The operations manager, like the supervisor, is responsible for the line operator, but also responsible for the supervisor, and has some other management duties. So in this case, they're trained on modules 1, 2, 3, and 5, okay? Or gray, yellow, green, and blue. Okay? So in this sense, again, if you, so a lot of people ask me, how am I supposed to make sure that people have a fallback? So if the manager is out, who covers the management position? Well, it would need to be someone who's trained on the roles of the manager. So in this case, you might train a supervisor on module 5 and have that supervisor be a backup for that manager. And you'd have the training records to support that. So in the event of an audit or inspection, and you have a supervisor coming from a manager, or this question is asked, you have a ready to go answer. Okay. So here's an example of module 1. This is the baseline training, applies to everybody. We have Module 2. This is just as an example, record-keeping procedures, work instructions. Here's the supervisor training. These might be supervisor policies, verification procedures, which are critical for both FSMA and GFSI. And here's one for maintenance. So maintenance is not affected by any of the other department trainings, but they're important for module. It's important that they're trained on Module 1, and now they have their own curated module. So you don't have maintenance sitting in a training room with everybody undergoing training for ops when they have nothing to do with it. This is a way, again, just like CCing people on emails, we want to limit who's trained on what, but make available everything. So if we find that it's important that maintenance is trained on things related to operations, then we can tag on those trainings for operations, for maintenance. Here's the manager training. And I'm just going to scroll through. Here you can see the maintenance managers trained now on maintenance work, as well as their own training. Here we have sales and marketing. And we have internal auditing procedures I've put under accounting. So here, Director of Operations now has director policies that they need to be trained on, but they also need to be trained on those things below them. Same thing for Director of Sales and Marketing. And for C-level executives, these are people that might not necessarily need training on work instructions. So their training might be more of an overview training, something that you can curate for them that focuses more on management, commitment, and responsibilities. What I like to attach to this modular training diagram is then sort of a description of the job responsibilities. So what is the president responsible for? What is the maintenance team responsible for? And these job descriptions are a way of also being able to very quickly evaluate performance and understanding. So if someone goes through a training, you can then read this job description and test that individual on whether or not they really understand their roles and responsibilities within the company. And that's an example of modular training. So we do have a lot of other presentations available to us on how to build these things and other approaches. So if you have any questions or you'd like to propose things for our upcoming presentations, please do send us an email. That's it for our presentation. We are 4 minutes shy of our end time. So please, if you have any questions, let me know. I can share my screen and navigate the web for you, show you answers to things that have really been on your mind. And if not, I'm just going to be sitting here and thinking about food safety.
All right, thank you, Michael. And while you are all brainstorming some questions that you can ask Michael, I'm going to flip this back to this slide that we had at the beginning of the presentation. This is Charlie, by the way. And this is, we do these free FSMA webinars every first business day of the month. So it happened to be on the 3rd of this month, but we'll do it on the 1st if it's a work day. And the whole idea is that the compliance deadline for small businesses for the preventive controls for human food rule is in September of this year. So leading up to that compliance deadline, we are partnering with UC San Diego Extension as well as other industry colleagues and companies to provide expert speakers and great content to share with everybody for free. So the idea is that high tide lifts all boats. So please spread the word about these webinars. The more interest there is, the more information we can make available, and you can sign up on our website. And I'm actually going to put the it's foodsafetyguys.com, sign up. Let's see, so I'm going to drop the link in just a second. But please feel free to spread it. You know, this is really a really great presentation. I'm really glad Michael will be here. So please, anyway, if you have any questions, put them out. If you have them later, feel free to send it to us in an email. We have 4 minutes left on the clock. So please feel free to think about it, add a comment. If you want to keep it personal, you can email us. But that's it. So let's give a silent round of applause for Michael. And thank you very much for coming and attending. We'll just hang out here for a few minutes. Just while we're getting
some thank yous.
Oh,
Appreciate
and I
that.
also want to let you know that the recording is going to be available later this afternoon.
Okay, well, Charlie, I suppose what we could do is we could share a screen and just navigate FSMA rules and guidance.
Yeah, you want to do it? Do it.
Sure. Okay, that's always fun. Let's see that. So I'm sharing my screen. Let's see, screen access. Just a moment. Okay, great. So here I am on FSMA rules and guidance. If you haven't visited this already, Amelia, I don't know if you're still there, but there's something really important for foreign facilities exporting to the United States, and that would be the Food Supplier Verification Program for importers of food for human and animal food, humans and animals. And if I select this, this will take me to a little summary page. You can find the full rule here in the Federal Register notice, but this is a nice little introduction to the rule. It does require that importers provide some assurance that the foreign suppliers do have records in place to demonstrate compliance with FDA rules. So the Prevent Controls for Human Food rule, I'll go back to that, is a new set of requirements that are applying to food facilities within the United States. And the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is sort of it's a rule that's to facilitate sort of the rollout of that rule, the implementation of that rule for importers. Foreign facilities are expected to comply with that rule, and the importers are sort of that role that's going to be help giving assurance that they are in fact in compliance. And I see that it's 11:01. So Charlie, I guess that's it.
I guess that's it. So stay tuned. We're going to announce the subject for next month's webinar for May. So stay tuned. If you are not on our webinar email list, sign up so you get the information before anybody else. So thanks again for coming out. Have a wonderful week. We'll talk to you next month. All right.
Bye bye.